A 6-year-old girl runs desperately through the soaked streets during a devastating storm, fleeing from men chasing her for stealing a piece of bread. Shivering with cold and fear, she escapes through a hole in the fence of a luxury condo and hides behind the bushes. When she sees a luxury car approaching, she timidly walks up to the elegant man who gets out of the vehicle and whispers, her voice trembling, "Sir, can I sleep in your dog's house?" Just until the storm passes. Soaking wet with hair stuck to her face, she is in a miserable state. What the millionaire does next when he sees a child asking to sleep where an animal would shocks even him. The rain poured down like an unyielding curtain over the city streets, turning sidewalks into rivers and intersections into treacherous lakes. The wind howled between the buildings with a fury that made windows rattle, while lightning cut through the night sky with startling white flashes. It was one of those storms that make people rush home and lock their doors, seeking the warmth and safety of their dwellings. But not everyone had that privilege. A small figure ran desperately through the drenched streets, her bare feet splashing in the icy puddles that formed every second. The 6-year-old girl gasped for breath, her small lungs burning with the effort of maintaining a frantic pace of escape. Her torn, soaked clothes clung to her frail body, and her brown hair plastered to her face like wet ropes. "Get back here, squirt!" A harsh voice bellowed behind her, almost swallowed by the deafening noise of the rain. The girl's heart beat so hard she could hear it over the storm. Her small hands still clutched the piece of bread she'd snatched from the bakery, a sliver of hope that meant the difference between another night of hunger or at least a few hours of relief for a stomach that had ached for days. She wasn't a thief by nature. At 6 years old, she knew perfectly well the difference between right and wrong. But when hunger gnaws so deeply it feels like someone is twisting your insides, when you haven't eaten for 3 days straight, the world's rules seem different, crueler, and unfair. The heavy footsteps of men echoed on the wet pavement, approaching dangerously close. She could feel desperation rising in her throat like bitter bile. She needed to hide, needed to disappear before they caught her. With eyes burning from tears that mixed with the rain, she spotted an ornate gate surrounding a luxurious gated community. Without a second thought, she threw herself onto the muddy ground and squeezed through a hole at the base of the gate, scratching her arms on the iron spikes, but managing to get through. On the other side, well-maintained bushes offered a perfect hiding spot. She curled up behind the foliage, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to control the sobs that threatened to betray her. The men ran past on the sidewalk, their voices fading into the distance. "Must have gone the other way," one of them shouted, and the footsteps gradually moved away until they disappeared completely. The girl remained motionless for long minutes, trembling not only from the cold but from fear and exhaustion. Around her, everything exuded opulence. Perfectly manicured lawns, colorful flowers dancing in the rain, elegant lampposts illuminating a cobblestone drive. It was a world completely different from hers. A world where people had warm homes and food on the table. It was then she heard the soft rumble of an approaching engine. A gleaming black car glided down the illuminated drive, its headlights cutting through the darkness like 2 golden eyes. Through the windshield, she could glimpse the silhouette of an elegant man at the wheel, his hands firm on the leather steering wheel as he returned from another day at work. Edward Vance had no idea his life was about to change forever. At 42, he owned one of the country's largest tech companies, a man accustomed to absolute control over every aspect of his existence. His 3-story mansion awaited him at the end of the drive with its designer furniture and carefully organized solitude. The girl watched the car approach, and something inside her stirred. Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps a courage she didn't even know she possessed. With shaky legs, she emerged from behind the bushes and slowly made her way toward the vehicle as it stopped in front of the garage. Edward turned off the engine and opened the door when he heard a small, trembling voice cut through the sound of the rain. "Mister, could I sleep in your doghouse?" just until the storm passes. Edward froze for a few seconds, the car key still in his hand, looking at that small, drenched figure who had emerged from the shadows like an apparition. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, but for a moment everything around them seemed silent, as if the whole world had stopped to witness that improbable encounter. The girl stood a few feet away, visibly trembling. Her torn clothes clung to her frail body, and he could see the scratches on her thin arms. But it was her eyes that hit him like a punch to the gut. Large, dark, filled with desperate hope mixed with terror. I don't have a dog," Edward murmured, still processing the surreal situation. His analytical mind, always so efficient at solving corporate problems, seemed to have stalled in the face of this raw, unexpected reality. "That's okay, mister," the girl whispered, lowering her eyes to the wet ground. "The garden is fine. I promise I won't make a mess. Just until it stops raining." The simplicity of those words cut Edward deeper than any corporate presentation he had ever heard. He looked around, as if expecting someone to appear and explain what was happening. But there was only the rain, the darkness, and a child asking for the bare minimum a human being could ask for, a dry place to spend the night. "You're hurt," he said, noticing the blood trickling from a cut on her knee. "What happened? Where are your parents?" The girl shrugged, a gesture that tried to appear nonchalant but revealed years of abandonment. "Don't worry about me, mister. I always manage. I just need a corner until morning." Edward felt something strange stirring in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Pity, anger, or perhaps something even more dangerous. The awakening of a humanity he had buried under layers of professional success and emotional isolation. "You can't stay out here," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "It's too cold, and you're soaked to the bone." The girl looked up, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something akin to hope. "Are you sure, mister? I don't want to be a bother. People like you usually don't like people like me." Those words were like a slap. Edward realized that, at 42, he'd become exactly the kind of person a desperate child thought wouldn't care about her suffering. The realization was devastating and, at the same time, liberating. "Come in," he said, opening the mansion's main door. "Let's get you out of this rain." The girl hesitated, looking at the imposing entrance with its marble pillars and crystal chandelier visible through the glass door. "I'll get everything dirty," she murmured, looking at her drenched and muddy clothes. "Furniture can be cleaned," Edward replied, and for the first time in years, he felt he had said something truly important. "Please, come in." She crossed the threshold as if stepping on sacred ground, her eyes widening as she took in the surrounding opulence. Edward observed her reaction and felt a strange mixture of pride and shame. He had spent a fortune decorating that house, but he had never noticed how it might appear to someone who had nothing. "My name is Edward," he said, closing the door behind them. "What's yours?" "Isabel," she replied softly, still looking around in amazement. "But everyone calls me Izzy." "Izzy," he repeated, liking the sound of the name. "How about a warm bath and something to eat?" Isabel's eyes filled with tears. "You'd really do that for me?" Edward knelt to be at her height, and for the first time in decades, he allowed his mask as a ruthless executive to fall completely. "Of course, Izzy. Everyone deserves a safe and warm place to spend the night." But as he led her upstairs, Edward had no idea that this simple decision was about to unleash a series of events that would test everything he believed about himself, about the world, and about the transformative power of true love. The mansion's guest bathroom was larger than many apartments. With its Italian marble bathtub and golden faucets shining under the crystal light of the chandelier, Isabel stood at the door, intimidated by the grandeur, unsure whether she should enter or not. "Come in, Izzy," Edward encouraged, turning on the bathtub faucets. "The water will be warm in a few minutes." While the tub filled, he went to get clean towels from the linen closet. They were Egyptian cotton towels, soft as clouds. which cost more than many people earned in a month. When he returned, he found Isabel still standing in the same spot, watching the steam rise from the water with an expression of pure wonder. "I've never seen such a big bathtub," she murmured, touching the marble rim with her fingertips. "It's like a tiny pool." Edward felt a pang in his chest. "Do you know how to swim?" "No," she replied simply, without any trace of self-pity. "But I can bathe myself. I learned when I was very little." The naturalness with which she spoke about her forced independence touched something deep in Edward's soul. He adjusted the water temperature and placed the towels on a nearby chair. "I'll leave you to it. When you're done, call me. I'll prepare something for you to eat." "Thank you, Mr. Edward," she said. And there was so much sincere gratitude in those two words that he had to turn away quickly to hide the emotion that threatened to overflow. In the kitchen, Edward found himself facing an unexpected dilemma. His refrigerator was full of expensive and sophisticated ingredients: caviar, imported cheeses, rare wines, but nothing that seemed appropriate for a hungry child. He decided on the simplest: warm milk with chocolate mix and some cookies he found in the pantry. As he heated the milk, he heard the sound of water moving in the bathtub and imagined Isabel discovering for the first time the pleasure of a truly warm bath. When was the last time he had appreciated something so simple? When was the last time he had allowed himself to feel grateful for the basic things in life? "Mr. Edward," Isabel's voice echoed from upstairs. "Can I come out now?" "I'll be right there," he replied, heading upstairs with one of the simplest t-shirts he could find in his wardrobe. Even so, the item would be enormous on her, but it was better than the soaked and torn clothes. When Isabel appeared wrapped in the towel, her clean hair falling in damp waves over her shoulders, Edward barely recognized her. Without the dirt and despair, she revealed a touching natural beauty: large expressive eyes, rosy cheeks from the warm bath, and a timid smile that lit up the entire hallway. "Thank you," she said again. This time her voice choked. "It's been a long time since I felt truly clean." Edward helped her put on the t-shirt, which indeed fit her like a dress, and led her back to the kitchen. The hot chocolate was ready, exuding a comforting aroma that made Isabel's stomach rumble audibly and embarrassingly. "Sorry," she murmured, putting her hands on her belly. "You don't have to apologize for being hungry," Edward said, pouring the chocolate into a porcelain mug. "When was the last time you ate?" Isabel paused to think, counting on her fingers. 3 days, she finally replied. "Or 4. Sometimes it's hard to remember." Edward's heart shattered. She took the mug with both small hands, as if it were a precious treasure, and drank the first sip with her eyes closed, savoring every second. Tears began to stream down her clean face. "It's too good," she whispered, looking at him with an admiration that made him feel simultaneously like a hero and like a human failure for having taken so long to realize that children like her existed in the world. "You can drink all of it," he said, pushing the plate of cookies towards her, "and eat as many cookies as you want." Isabel ate slowly, as if she wanted to make it last forever, and Edward realized he was witnessing something sacred: the simple act of a hungry child eating, one of the most basic and essential miracles of human life. When she finished, her eyes began to droop with sleep. "Can I sleep on the couch?" she asked. "I promise I won't mess anything up." Edward knew that innocent question was about to change everything. Edward woke up earlier than usual, something uncommon for a man accustomed to sleeping late on weekends. A strange sensation had pulled him from sleep, the awareness that he was no longer alone in the house. For a moment, he wondered if he had dreamed about the previous night, but then he heard soft noises coming from the kitchen. Descending the stairs silently, he found Isabel standing on a chair, trying to reach something in a high cabinet. She had carefully folded the t-shirt she had worn to sleep and put on her clothes from the night before again, now dry but still visibly worn and patched. "Good morning," he said softly, so as not to startle her. Isabel turned, almost losing her balance on the chair. "Mr. Edward, I'm sorry. I was just trying to wash the mug I used yesterday. I didn't want to leave you any work." Edward helped her down from the chair, touched by her concern. "You don't need to wash anything, Izzy. And why did you put those clothes back on?" "Because I'm leaving now," she replied with a naturalness that chilled him. "It's stopped raining, and I can't impose on your kindness. You've already done so much for me." "Leaving? Where to?" Isabel shrugged, the same gesture she had made the night before, but now Edward could see through it. It was a defense, a way of hiding vulnerability behind apparent independence. "I always manage, Mr. Edward. Don't worry about me. But where will you sleep? Where will you eat?" The urgency in Edward's voice surprised him. When had he started to care so much? "There are plenty of places in the city," Isabel said vaguely, avoiding his gaze. "People like me always find a spot. People like you." Edward knelt to be at her height. "Izzy, you're a 6-year-old child. You should be playing, going to school, being cared for by a family that loves you." Isabel's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. "I know I should, Mr. Edward, but sometimes life isn't how it should be, right? And I've learned to take care of myself. I'm stronger than I look." The dignity of that small child left Edward speechless. Here was someone who had faced more adversity in 6 years than he had in his entire privileged life. And yet she maintained an inner strength and consideration for others that shamed him. "What if I don't want you to leave?" Isabel looked at him in surprise. "Why? You don't even know me well." "Perhaps I want to get to know you better," Edward said, surprised to be saying it. "Maybe you can stay a few more days until we decide what's best for you." "Decide," she repeated, and there was something dangerous in that word. Hope. "Yes," Edward confirmed, feeling he was making a promise whose consequences he couldn't foresee. "You and I, together." Isabel was silent for a long moment, biting her lower lip as she did when she was thinking, "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden, and people from your class don't usually mix with people from mine." "What class do you think I am?" "Rich," she replied simply. "And I'm poor, very poor." Sometimes people get uncomfortable with that. Edward felt a pang of pain as he realized how a child so small had already internalized society's cruel divisions. "You know what I think, Izzy? I think there are only 2 kinds of people in the world, the good ones and the bad ones, and you are clearly a good person." A timid smile bloomed on Isabel's face, completely transforming her expression. "You're a good person too, Mr. Edward. Last night was the first time in a long time I slept without fear." These words hit Edward like a revelation. How many nights had that child spent in fear? How many times had she slept outdoors, vulnerable and alone? The simple thought solidified his determination. "Then it's settled," he said, standing up. "You're staying, at least until we find a better solution." "A better solution like what?" Edward paused, realizing he hadn't thought it through properly. "I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out together, okay?" Isabel nodded, but Edward could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Mr. Edward." "Yes. What if the better solution is for me to leave anyway?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, laden with all the complications Edward was only beginning to comprehend. The next 3 days passed like a strange and wonderful dream for both of them. Edward cancelled work commitments for the first time in years, claiming a personal emergency that was technically not a lie. Isabel explored the mansion with the reverent care of someone visiting a museum, touching the expensive objects with her fingertips, as if afraid of breaking them just by looking. On the morning of the 4th day, Edward decided to take her to buy new clothes. There was something deeply wrong about seeing a child wearing the same torn clothes day after day, no matter how carefully she washed them every night in the bathroom sink. "You don't have to, Mr. Edward," Isabel protested when he mentioned the idea. "These clothes still fit." "Izzy, you deserve to have beautiful new clothes," he said, grabbing his car keys. All children do. The mall was familiar territory for Edward, but seeing it through Isabel's eyes was like discovering an alien planet. She froze at the entrance, watching the gleaming stores, the escalators, the well-dressed people walking with colorful bags. "It's so big," she whispered, squeezing his hand tightly. "What if I get lost?" "I won't let you get lost," Edward promised, realizing how natural this responsibility had become for him. "We'll go slow, okay?" In the children's clothing store, Isabel initially refused to try anything on. "It's too expensive, mister. Look at these prices," she said, pointing to a tag. "With that money, you could buy food for a whole month." Her observation made him stop and truly look at the prices. When was the last time he had worried about the cost of anything? To him, money was just numbers in a bank account. But to Isabel, it represented the difference between eating and starving. "Izzy," he said gently, "I have more money than I could spend in a lifetime. Let me use a little of it to make you happy, okay?" Reluctantly, she chose the cheapest items in the store. A simple pair of jeans, 2 basic t-shirts, and a blue dress that her eyes couldn't help but admire, even as she tried to hide it. "That dress too," Edward told the saleswoman. "No, mister, it's too expensive," Isabel protested, but her voice carried a desire so pure it broke his heart. "It's your first new dress, isn't it?" he asked. Isabel nodded, biting her lip. "Then it has to be special." As the saleswoman wrapped their purchases, Edward watched Isabel in the mirror, trying on the blue dress. She spun slowly, watching the flared skirt unfurl, and her smile was so genuine and radiant that it lit up the entire store. "Thank you, Mr. Edward," she said, hugging his waist tightly. "I'll never forget it." Leaving the mall, Edward felt more fulfilled than after any multi-million-dollar deal he had closed. But his sense of well-being evaporated when he saw 3 men standing near his car, looking directly at them. "Izzy," he murmured, "do you know those men?" Isabel followed his gaze and instantly paled. Her small hand squeezed his with desperate force. "It's them," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "The men who chased me the night of the storm." Edward felt his blood run cold. The men had noticed they were recognized and began to walk towards them, with a determination that left no doubt about their intentions. "Mr. Edward," Isabel said, tugging at his sleeve, "we need to run. They're dangerous." "No," Edward said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "We're not running, but they... Izzy, you're with me now, and I won't let anyone hurt you." The men approached, and the largest of them, a scruffy bearded man with cold eyes, spoke with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, boss, looks like you found our little friend." Edward instinctively pulled Isabel behind him. "You're chasing a child because of a piece of bread." "It's not about the bread, mister," another man said, spitting on the ground. "It's about respect. The kid invaded our territory." Territory. Edward felt anger rising in his chest. "She's a hungry child, and now she's your problem," the first man said, taking a step forward. "But maybe we can come to an agreement." It was then that Edward realized that protecting Isabel would mean facing a world of violence and threats that his wealth had never been able to keep him completely away from. Edward had never felt true hatred until that moment. Looking at those men threatening a defenseless child, he felt a primitive fury grow in his chest, something that transcended his refined education and years of civilized corporate negotiations. "What kind of agreement do you have in mind?" he asked, keeping his voice controlled while Isabel clung to his back. The bearded man smiled, showing yellowed teeth. $100 to forget this whole story. The kid disappears from our sight and everyone's happy." $100. Edward almost laughed at the insignificance of the amount. "You're extorting a child for $100. "It's not about the money, boss," the second man interjected. "It's about showing that nobody disrespects us in our area. If we let it slide, tomorrow every street kid will think they can do whatever they want." Edward felt Isabel tremble behind him. "Mister," she whispered, "please, let's go. I don't want them to hurt you because of me." Her concern for his safety, even while she was in danger, was the last straw. Edward pulled his wallet from his pocket and counted out $200, double what they had asked for. "Here's the money," he said, extending the bills. "Now get out of our sight and never approach her again." The bearded man took the money, but his smile became even more sinister. "Thanks for the generosity, mister, but this doesn't solve the problem." "What do you mean?" "The kid is still our problem. You can take her home today. Give her a bath. Buy her pretty clothes," he said, gesturing to the shopping bags. "But she'll always come back to the streets. It's her nature. And when she comes back, we'll be waiting." "She's not going back to the streets," Edward said with a conviction that surprised him. The three men laughed. "Oh yeah, and what are you going to do? Adopt her?" asked the third man, who had remained silent until then. "Rich man like you thinks you just want it, and it's done. There's a lot of paperwork to sign, a lot of bureaucrats to convince, and while that's happening, where does the girl stay?" Edward realized they were right about one thing. He hadn't thought about the legal complications. Isabel couldn't simply stay in his house indefinitely without proper documentation. "That's none of your business," he said. "No, it's not," the bearded man agreed. "Our problem will be solved another way. Get this straight. Boss, the girl might sleep in your mansion for a few days, but sooner or later she'll leave. Go to school, go to the doctor, go for a walk, and we have time. Plenty of time." The implicit threat was clear. Edward felt Isabel shrink even further behind him. "You're threatening a child in front of dozens of witnesses," Edward said, pointing to the people passing in the parking lot. "Don't you think that's foolish?" "Witnesses?" The man looked around and laughed. "What witnesses, boss? Everyone here has their own problems. Nobody's going to get involved in a fight that isn't theirs." As if to prove his point, the few people who had noticed the commotion averted their gaze and quickened their pace, clearly wanting to avoid any involvement. Edward realized he was alone. His wealth, which had always been his protection, meant nothing there. Those men knew the rules of a different world from his, a world where violence was currency and intimidation, a tool of the trade. "What exactly do you want?" he asked. "We want you to understand your position," the bearded man said, putting the money in his pocket. "You're rich, important. You have a reputation to protect. We have nothing to lose. Think about it. Is it worth risking all that for a street kid?" Edward looked back at Isabel, who watched him with eyes full of silent tears. She had prepared herself to be abandoned again. He could see it in her resigned expression. "Yes," he said, turning back to the men. "It's worth every penny I have." The bearded man lost his smile. "Then you've chosen the wrong side of this war, boss." "No," Edward replied, taking Isabel by the hand and walking towards the car. "I chose the right side. And if you approach her again, you'll find that rich men also know how to fight when they need to." But as he drove home, Edward knew he had just declared a war for which he was unprepared. 3 days after the confrontation at the mall, Edward was in his office trying to focus on financial reports when the doorbell rang. It was a Tuesday morning, and Isabel was in the garden, playing with the butterflies visiting the flowers, a sight that had become precious to him, but which now made him nervous. Since the encounter with the men, he had constantly found himself looking out the windows, checking if she was safe. The door was answered by Maria, his trusted housekeeper, who had worked in the house for over 10 years. Edward heard voices in the foyer and went downstairs to see who it was. At the foot of the stairs, he stopped abruptly. A woman of approximately 35 was standing in the entrance, wearing a discreet but professional suit. Her brown hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, and she carried a leather briefcase, but it was her eyes that caught Edward's attention. They were kind but determined, with a depth that suggested someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "Mr. Vance?" she asked, extending her hand. "My name is Dr. Caroline Evans. I'm a social worker with the county. I need to speak with you about a complaint we received." Edward's heart pounded. "Complaint?" "About a child in an irregular situation who is reportedly living in your residence," Caroline explained, consulting a folder. Isabel Santos, 6 years old, without proper documentation for residing at the location. Edward felt the ground give way beneath his feet. How did you know? We received an anonymous tip, Caroline said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she too was not entirely comfortable with the situation. May I come in? It's better if we talk in private. Edward led her to the living room, his mind racing. The men from the mall had carried out their threat faster than he had imagined. Doctor, I can explain the situation. Please, call the child, Caroline interrupted gently but firmly. I need to see her and speak with her. She's in the garden. But Dr. Evans, you need to understand that Isabel is not an intruder or anything like that. She was in danger, cold and hungry. Mr. Vance, Caroline said, raising her hand, I'm not here to judge you. On the contrary, your intentions seem to be the best possible, but there is a legal protocol that must be followed when a vulnerable child is found. When Isabel appeared at the living room door, still with dirt on her hands from playing in the garden, Edward saw the instant change in her expression. The smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of terror he had seen before, that of a child accustomed to being removed from places where she felt safe. Hello, Isabel, Caroline said softly, kneeling to be at the girl's height. I'm Caroline. I work helping children like you. I didn't do anything wrong, Isabel said quickly, wiping her hands on her t-shirt. I didn't break anything. I didn't make a mess. Mr. Edward can confirm. I know you didn't do anything wrong. Dear, Caroline assured her. In fact, I came here because I'm concerned about you. I need to know if you're okay, if you're being well cared for. Isabel looked nervously at Edward, then back at Caroline. Mr. Edward takes very good care of me. He gives me food every day, lets me take hot baths, and bought new clothes for me. He's a good person. Caroline made some notes, carefully observing the interaction between Edward and Isabel. Isabel, would you like to stay here? Very much, Isabel replied without hesitation. But what? People like me don't stay in places like this forever, she said, lowering her eyes. I know that eventually I'll have to leave. Edward felt as if he had been punched in the gut. In 1 week, Isabel had emotionally prepared herself to be abandoned again. Caroline spent over an hour talking separately with Isabel and then with Edward. When she finally closed her briefcase, her expression was thoughtful. Mr. Vance, it's obvious that Isabel is flourishing under your care. Her physical and emotional transformation is remarkable, but legally, the situation is complicated. What does that mean? It means I need to follow protocol. Isabel should be placed in an appropriate institution while we investigate her family situation and evaluate options for permanent placement. An institution? You mean an orphanage? A temporary shelter, yes. Edward saw the terror return to Isabel's eyes. Please, he said, give me more time. Let her stay here while we complete the necessary procedures. I can provide all the documentation needed. Caroline hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and what her eyes were seeing. That would be irregular. But it would be best for Isabel, Edward insisted. You yourself saw how well she's doing here. After a long silence, Caroline sighed. I'll give you 2 weeks to regularize the situation, but if there's no significant progress in the legal procedures, I'll have to take her to a temporary shelter. When Caroline left, Edward hugged Isabel, who was crying silently. Mr. Edward, she whispered, I don't want to go to an orphanage. You won't, he promised, not knowing how he would keep that promise. I won't let that happen. But when the door closed, Edward realized he had just made a commitment that would change his life forever. The morning after Caroline's visit, Edward was trying to research adoption processes online when his phone rang. The name on the caller ID made him sigh heavily. Eleanor Vance, his older sister and, unfortunately, the most formidable and intimidating person he knew. Edward, we need to talk. Now, Eleanor said without preamble when he answered, Good morning to you too, Eleanor. Don't be ironic with me. I heard from Marcia Thorne that you have a street kid living in your house. Please tell me it's just a malicious rumor. Edward closed his eyes. Marcia Thorne was the biggest gossip in the elite social circle his family belonged to. If she knew, soon all of society would be talking. It's not a rumor, Eleanor. And she's not a street kid. She's Isabel, a child who needed help. A glacial silence followed. Edward Vance, have you completely lost your mind? Do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation? Our family's reputation? Yes, ours. You don't live in a bubble, Edward. Our companies do business together. We frequent the same social circles. When you do something like this, it reflects on all of us. Edward felt the familiar anger rise whenever he talked to Eleanor. Something like this, helping a child in need. Don't give me that philanthropic talk, Eleanor countered. If you want to do charity, donate money to reputable institutions. But bringing an unknown child into your home, a child you found on the street, Edward, you have no idea where she came from, what kind of people are behind her. She's 6 years old. Eleanor, so what? Do you think criminals don't use children to run scams, that there's no organized crime behind this? Edward, you are one of the most respected businessmen in this city. You have millions in assets. You've become a target. Edward heard light footsteps on the stairs and saw Isabel descending, already dressed in one of the new clothes he had bought for her. She paused, realizing he was in a tense conversation, and Edward gave her a reassuring nod, indicating that everything was fine. Eleanor, I have to hang up now. No, you don't. I'm coming over. I need to see with my own eyes what madness you've gotten yourself into. No, Eleanor, don't come here. Edward, I am your older sister, and I've been responsible for you since our parents died. I won't let you destroy everything our family built because of a messiah complex. The call ended abruptly. Edward put his phone away, knowing Eleanor would be at his door in less than an hour. That was her. When she decided to interfere, nothing stopped her. Mr. Edward, Isabel said timidly, was the person on the phone mad at you because of me? Edward knelt beside her. No, Izzy. She was just worried, that's all. Is she your family? My sister. Isabel nodded, biting her lip. She doesn't want me to stay here. The girl's perception surprised him. What makes you think that? Because I know this kind of talk, Isabel said with a wisdom too sad for her age. I've heard it many times, adults talking about kids like me as if we're problems that need to be solved. Edward felt his heart break. You're not a problem, Izzy. You've never been a problem. I know you think that, she said, climbing onto the couch beside him. But I also know that sometimes the people we love have to choose between us and other important things. What do you mean? Is Aunt Eleanor important to you? She's my sister. And am I important to you? Edward looked into her eyes, those large, expressive eyes that had changed his life. Very important, Izzy. Then you'll have to choose, she said simply. And I don't want you to lose your family because of me. The maturity of that child left him speechless. How could a 6-year-old understand complex family dynamics better than many adults? Izzy, do you want to know something? Sometimes family isn't just who you're born with. Sometimes family is the people we choose to love and who choose to love us back. Isabel smiled, but there was sadness in her smile. That's beautiful, Mr. Edward. But the world doesn't work like that for people like me. Before Edward could respond, the doorbell rang. Eleanor had arrived. Izzy, he said, standing up. I want you to go to the garden and stay there until I call you, okay? No matter what you hear. Isabel nodded and went to the back of the house. Edward took a deep breath and went to open the door, knowing he was about to face one of the toughest battles of his life. Eleanor stood at the door with her most severe expression, impeccably dressed as always, looking like a judge about to deliver a verdict. Where is she? She asked, entering uninvited. Eleanor, we need to talk before anything else. There's nothing to talk about, Edward. You're going to fix this situation today, or I will fix it for you. Eleanor entered the mansion like an elegant hurricane, her high heels echoing on the marble of the foyer. Edward knew her well enough to know she had come prepared for a war, and by the look on her face, she had no intention of losing. "Where is the child?" she asked again, looking around as if Isabel might appear at any moment. "In the garden," Edward replied. "And Eleanor, before you do anything, I need you to understand that Isabel is not what you're imagining." "Oh, she's not?" Eleanor opened her designer purse and pulled out a tablet. "Then explain these photos to me." Edward looked at the screen and felt his blood run cold. They were photos of Isabel with him at the mall, taken from a distance, but clear enough to plainly show the two of them together in the children's clothing store. "Marcia sent me this morning," Eleanor said coldly. "Apparently, you two were seen by several acquaintances of ours. The photos are already circulating in social groups. Edward, do you have any idea what this looks like?" "Looks like what?" "It looks like a 42-year-old single man who never showed interest in children, suddenly appearing with an unknown girl, buying expensive clothes for her, treating her as if she were his daughter." Eleanor paused dramatically. "People are asking questions, Edward. Very unpleasant questions." Edward felt nauseous. "What kind of questions? Do you really want me to say it out loud?" Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and pity. "Edward, you're an intelligent man. Use your head. A rich, single businessman with no history of serious relationships, suddenly adopting a street kid. How do you think that sounds?" The implication hit Edward like a slap. "Eleanor, are you suggesting people think I'm saying people always think the worst," Eleanor interrupted. "And in this case, the worst can destroy not only your reputation, but also your businesses, our family company, everything." Edward sank into an armchair, feeling the weight of the situation. He had been naive to think he could simply help Isabel without consequences. The world didn't work like that for men in his position. "But you know me, Eleanor. You know I would never." "I know," Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly. "Of course I know, but what I know doesn't matter. What matters is what others think, what they say, what they spread on social media and at business dinners. So what do you suggest I do? Abandon Isabel?" "I suggest you act like a responsible adult," Eleanor said, settling into the armchair opposite him. "Call the proper authorities. Turn the girl over to those who have the structure to care for her adequately and go back to your normal life before it's too late. She's not an object to be handed over, Eleanor. She's a child who has already suffered too many abandonments in her life." "Edward, listen to yourself." Eleanor raised her voice for the first time. "You're talking as if you're her father. You've known her for a week. 1 week. Edward!" "And it's been the most meaningful week of my life in years," he replied, surprising both of them with the honesty of his declaration. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "My God," she murmured. "You're emotionally involved with her." "Of course, I am. She's an extraordinary child, Eleanor, smart, brave, kind, despite everything she's been through. When you meet her—" "I'm not going to meet her," Eleanor said firmly. "And you're going to stop this fantasy now, before it's too late. Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," Eleanor replied, standing up. "Edward, I'm giving you 24 hours to resolve this situation. If you don't do anything, I will take the necessary measures to protect our family." "What measures?" Eleanor hesitated, and for the first time, Edward saw uncertainty in her eyes. "I have contacts in social services. I can expedite the child's removal." Edward felt as if he had been struck by lightning. "You would do that? Harm an innocent child just to protect our reputation?" "I would do anything to protect this family," Eleanor said, but her voice carried less conviction than before. "Edward, please be reasonable. You can't save every child in the world." "I don't want to save every child in the world," Edward said, standing up as well. "I just want to save this one." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and Edward saw something that rarely appeared on his sister's face, genuine sadness. "You'll regret this," she said softly, "and when you do, it'll be too late to turn back." After Eleanor left, Edward remained standing in the empty room. hearing the echo of her words. Through the window, he could see Isabel in the garden, innocently playing with the flowers, unaware of the storm brewing around her. For the first time since he found her, Edward wondered if he truly had the strength to protect her from a world that seemed determined to separate them. 2 days after Eleanor's visit, Edward was in his office trying to focus on contracts when Marina announced that Dr. Caroline Evans had arrived for a follow-up visit. This time, she wasn't alone. She had brought an assistant and an even more voluminous folder. "How is Isabel adjusting?" Caroline asked as soon as she sat down, but Edward noticed that her posture was more relaxed than during their first visit. "Very well," he replied. "She's eating regularly, sleeping better, and last night she even laughed while watching a movie with me. It was the first time I'd seen her truly laugh." Caroline made notes, but Edward noticed a small smile on her lips. "May I speak with her?" "Of course. She's in the garden with Marina, learning to care for the plants." When Isabel entered the room a few minutes later, the transformation was even more evident. Her hair shone, her skin had gained a healthy color, and she moved with more confidence. But most striking was how her eyes had changed. They still carried the premature wisdom of someone who had suffered much, but now they also sparkled with something Edward took a while to identify: hope. "Hello, Isabel," Caroline said warmly. "How are you?" "Good, Ms. Caroline," Isabel replied, climbing onto the couch next to Edward with natural ease. "Mr. Edward taught me how to make hot chocolate yesterday. Would you like me to make you some?" "Perhaps later, dear. First, I want to know about your routine here." Isabel enthusiastically recounted her activities: mornings in the garden, afternoons reading the books Edward had bought for her, evenings watching movies or listening to stories. Caroline listened attentively, asking questions and observing the interactions between Edward and Isabel. "Isabel," Caroline said after a few minutes, "do you remember where you lived before coming here?" Isabel's smile faded slightly. "I remember at St. Jude's Home for Children." Edward felt a shiver. "An orphanage. I ran away from there," Isabel said simply. "The aunts were not very kind." Caroline and Edward exchanged glances. "Isabel, can you tell me a little about these aunts? They yelled a lot, and sometimes they forgot to give us food. And there was one aunt who hit the children when no one was looking." Isabel spoke without drama, as if she were reporting the weather. "That's why I ran away. I'd rather starve on the street than stay there." Edward felt a fury rise in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Izzy, because adults never believe children when they speak ill of other adults," she replied with that devastating wisdom. "And because I didn't want you to think I was making up a story so I wouldn't have to go back there." Caroline stopped writing and looked directly at Isabel. "Sweetheart, you know it's my job to make sure children like you are safe, right?" Isabel nodded. "And what if I tell you that I believe you?" Isabel's eyes filled with surprise. "You really believe me?" "I do. And I will investigate these allegations you made about St. Jude's Home for Children." After Isabel left to continue playing in the garden, Caroline remained silent for a few minutes, organizing her thoughts. "Mr. Edward," she said finally, "I need to be honest with you. Please." When I received the first report about Isabel being here, I came prepared to find an irregular situation that would need to be corrected quickly. But what I found was... She hesitated. "It was a child flourishing under genuine and loving care." Edward felt his heart race. "And does that change anything?" "Professionally, it shouldn't. But personally..." Caroline blushed slightly. "Mr. Edward, may I ask you an indiscreet question?" "Of course." "Have you seriously considered adopting Isabel?" The question Edward had been avoiding asking himself was finally on the table. Yes. I've been thinking about it, but it's complicated, isn't it? A single man, no experience with children, but with the resources to give her everything she needs, and more importantly, with genuine love to offer," Caroline completed. Mr. Edward, in 15 years working with adoption, I can say I've seen many perfect homes on paper that were disastrous in reality, and some unlikely homes that became beautiful families. Do you think Isabel would be happy with me? I think Isabel is already happy with you, Caroline replied. The question is, would you be happy being her father? Edward looked out the window, where Isabel was teaching Marina how to make flower crowns, her clear laughter echoing in the afternoon air. The answer came without hesitation. It would be the happiest thing that could happen to me, Caroline smiled, and Edward realized it wasn't just a professional smile. Then perhaps we can find a way to make that possible. Even with all the legal complications. Complications exist to be resolved, Caroline said, and sometimes, and when we find a true family, it's worth facing any bureaucracy. Edward looked into her eyes and saw something that surprised him. It wasn't just professional determination, but something more personal, warmer. Dr. Evans, he said impulsively, would you like to have dinner with us tonight? Isabel would love to cook something special for you. Caroline's smile became even more radiant. I'd love to. Edward. May I call you Edward? Please. And at that moment, Edward realized his life was about to get complicated in a completely new and unexpected way. Dinner had been perfect. Isabel had prepared a salad with Marina's help, while Edward had cooked a risotto he'd learned on a trip to Italy. Caroline was charmed by the family dynamic that had naturally formed between them, and for the first time in weeks, Edward felt truly optimistic about the future. The next day, Caroline proposed taking Isabel for a routine medical checkup, part of the process of regularizing her situation. It's protocol, she explained, but I also want to make sure she's completely healthy. Edward hesitated. Since the confrontation at the mall, he had avoided going out with Isabel, fearing another encounter with the men who had pursued her. Maybe I should go with you. Edward, you have an important meeting with investors today, Caroline reminded him. And I do this every day. Isabel will be safe with me. Isabel, who was excited about the idea of an outing, convinced Edward. Mr. Edward, Ms. Caroline knows how to take care of children. It's her job. Reluctantly, Edward agreed. He watched the two of them leave that morning, Caroline driving her small but reliable car, Isabel waving excitedly from the window. It was such a normal domestic scene that he wondered why he was feeling an inexplicable unease. The meeting with investors lasted longer than expected. When Edward finally managed to check his phone, it was almost 4 in the afternoon, and he had 7 missed calls from Caroline. His heart pounded. He called her back immediately. Caroline answered on the first ring, her voice laden with panic. Edward, thank God, they took Isabel. Who took Isabel? Caroline, where are you? At the hospital. We were leaving the appointment when 3 men approached. One of them showed me a photo of you and Isabel at the mall, said they knew where she was living. Caroline was sobbing into the phone. Edward, they knew your name. They knew about me. They knew everything. Edward felt the world collapse. Are you hurt? No, they didn't hurt me. But Edward, they left a message. They said you have 24 hours to deposit $50,000 into an account they'll send you. If I don't, what? They said Isabel will disappear forever. Edward closed his eyes, trying to control the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. Where exactly are you? I'm coming to get you. St. Luke's Hospital, in the ER. Edward, I should have listened to you. I should have let you come with us. Caroline, this isn't your fault. Stay where you are. I'm on my way. Edward drove like a madman through the city streets, his mind racing faster than the car. $50,000 was no problem. He had much more than that in checking accounts. But he knew it wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and the fact that men like them usually didn't keep agreements. He found Caroline in the hospital waiting room, visibly shaken. She threw herself into his arms as soon as she saw him. I'm so sorry, she murmured against his chest. They appeared out of nowhere. Isabel was terrified when she saw me, tried to run, but they were faster. Tell me exactly what happened, Edward said, guiding her to a bench. We were leaving through the main entrance when a large bearded man approached. He showed the photo of you two and said, "We know you're helping the boss hide our merchandise." Merchandise, Edward. They called Isabel merchandise. Edward felt nauseous. Continue. Isabel recognized the man immediately. She went white as a sheet and whispered, "No." They found me. I tried to protect her, but two other men appeared. One held my arms while the other grabbed Isabel. Did Isabel resist? Caroline nodded, tears streaming down her face. She screamed your name, Edward. She screamed, "Mr. Edward, help me," until they put her in the car. Edward had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The image of Isabel screaming for him as she was dragged away by those criminals was more than he could bear. Did they say anything else? The bearded man laughed and said, "Now your little boss will learn that there are consequences for meddling where you don't belong." And then he gave me a paper with payment instructions. Caroline handed him a crumpled sheet with a scribbled bank account and simple instructions. $50,000 by midnight. No cops, no tricks, or the merchandise turns into a corpse. Edward looked at the paper, but the words blurred. Isabel was in the hands of those men. The girl who had learned to trust him, who called him Mr. Edward with such affection, who had finally found a safe place to call home. "We'll pay the money," he said. "Edward, you can't trust them. What if they pay and don't return Isabel? What if we don't pay and they hurt her?" Edward looked into Caroline's eyes. "Caroline, I can't live knowing Isabel is suffering because of me. I have to try." Caroline took his hands. "Then let's try together. But Edward, after we pay, if they don't return Isabel, we'll have to call the police." Edward nodded, but deep down he knew that if it came to that point, it might be too late. At 11:40 p.m., Edward stood in front of an ATM at a deserted bank branch, with Caroline by his side and $50,000 in cash in a backpack. The money had been wired as instructed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "They should have called by now," Caroline murmured, checking her phone for the 10th time in 5 minutes. Edward looked at the car's dashboard clock. 11:45. Maybe they're testing our patience. Edward's phone rang exactly at midnight. It was an unknown number. "Hello? Boss, I see you're a man of your word," said the familiar voice of the bearded man. "The money's all here, correct? Where's Isabel? Calm down, calm down. Business is business, but it turns out we had some extra costs, you understand. The kid was a lot of trouble. She screamed, tried to run, even broke one of my guys' cell phones." Edward clenched his fist. "Where is Isabel?" "She's alive, if that's what you want to know. A little scared, but alive. Now, about those extra costs." "How much?" "Another 50,000, and this time, no extensions." "You have 2 hours. That wasn't part of the deal." "The deal changed, boss. We found out some interesting things about you. Did you know your sister has been making calls to authorities, trying to speed up the girl's removal from your house? Interesting how you rich people solve problems, huh?" Edward felt as if he had been punched in the gut. Eleanor had made good on her threat. "So we thought," the man continued, "if the boss's own family doesn't want the girl around, maybe she's worth more to us in other schemes. Illegal adoption market. You know how it is. Plenty of rich couples looking for a pretty kid with no questions asked." "You wouldn't dare!" Edward exploded, but Caroline held his arm. "Wouldn't dare what? The girl has no family, no papers, nobody's looking for her, except you, of course. So the question is, how much is she worth to you?" "Boss," Edward took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. 100,000. Is that what you want? Now you're speaking my language, but there's a condition." "What?" "You come alone to bring the money. No social worker, no cops, no tricks, just you." Caroline shook her head vigorously, whispering no. "Where?" Edward asked. "Old Harbor Road, Warehouse 47. You know it." Edward knew it. It was an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of the city, perfect for crimes no one wanted to witness. I'll be there in 2 hours. Edward, no, Caroline whispered as soon as he hung up. It's an obvious trap. I know, Edward said, starting the car, but I have no choice. You do. Let's call the police now. Caroline, you heard what he said. If the police show up, they'll make Isabel disappear. And you know men like these don't make empty threats. Caroline was silent for a moment. Then I'm coming with you. No, Edward, I care about Isabel too. And more than that, she hesitated. I care about you. Edward looked at her, seeing for the first time clearly what had been in Caroline's eyes for weeks. Caroline, you don't need to say anything, she said quickly. Just let me go with you. If something goes wrong, at least we'll have a witness. What if something goes wrong with both of us? Caroline picked up her phone. Then I'll leave a recorded message for my supervisor with all the details, scheduled to be sent if I don't cancel it in 3 hours. An hour and a half later, they were driving down the dark road that led to the harbor. Edward had only managed to get $80,000, all the money he could gather in such a short time. He hoped it would be enough. Edward, Caroline said as they approached the location, if anything happens to us, I want you to know that these last few days have been the happiest I've had in years. You and Isabel have become my family. Edward held her hand. Caroline, when we get out of here with Isabel, we're going to talk about what that means for us, okay? She nodded, but both knew there might not be an after. Warehouse 47 was a concrete building surrounded by rusty containers. A single light flickered at the entrance. Edward parked where instructed and turned off the engine. They're watching us, Caroline murmured. I know. Edward took the backpack with the money and got out of the car. The silence of the place was broken only by the distant sound of trucks on the main road. Boss! A voice shouted from inside the warehouse. Come in alone! The woman stays in the car. Edward looked at Caroline one last time. If I'm not out in 10 minutes, leave and call the police. Edward, promise. I promise. Edward walked towards the warehouse entrance, carrying not just $80,000, but all his hopes of saving the girl who had changed his life forever. Inside the warehouse, the only illumination came from a bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting sinister shadows on the concrete walls. Edward advanced slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, when he heard a small, familiar voice. Mr. Edward? Isabel was tied to an old chair in the center of the warehouse, her eyes swollen from crying, but shining with relief at seeing him. Edward felt his heart break and recompose at the same time. Izzy, are you okay? I am now, she said, trying to smile through her tears. How touching, said the bearded man, stepping out of the shadows accompanied by 2 other criminals. A family reunion. Where's the money? Boss? Edward raised the backpack. 80,000, it's all I could get together in such short notice. 80,000. The man laughed bitterly. I said 100,000. And I said it was all I could get, Edward retorted, taking a step forward. Take the money and give me Isabel back. You've already made more in 2 weeks than you do in a whole year threatening kids. One of the other men whispered something in the leader's ear, who nodded with a cruel smile. You know, boss, we've been thinking, why accept 80,000 today when we can make a lot more tomorrow? The girl's pretty, smart. She'll make a lot of money on the right market. Edward felt his blood run cold. You won't touch her. Oh no, and who's going to stop us? You! The 3 men laughed. It was then that Isabel spoke, her voice small but surprisingly firm. I did. Everyone looked at her, confused. What did you say, squirt? The leader asked. I said I did, Isabel repeated, and Edward noticed she didn't look scared anymore. Before you guys got here, I heard you talking about your plans, and you know what I did? The men exchanged glances, suddenly less confident. I wrote everything down on a piece of paper and put it in Ms. Caroline's pocket when you weren't looking, Isabel continued. Your names, what you do to other children, where you live, everything I heard you talking about. You're lying, the leader said, but his voice carried uncertainty. Am I? Isabel tilted her head. Your name is Mark Riley. You live at 247 Blossom Lane. You have an 8-year-old daughter who goes to St. Francis Elementary and doesn't know her daddy's a criminal. The man paled. How did you? And you? Isabel looked at the second man. John Davis. Your mother's admitted to Hope Springs Medical Center and thinks you work in construction. Edward watched, fascinated, as Isabel psychologically disarmed the 3 criminals with information she had collected during her captivity. The girl who had survived alone on the streets had used her intelligence and observation skills to protect herself. And guess what else? Isabel continued. Ms. Caroline isn't alone in the car. She called some police friends before coming here. They should be arriving any minute now. As if on cue, distant sirens began to echo in the night. You have 2 options, Edward said, realizing Isabel had created the perfect opportunity. Take the money, give me Isabel back, and disappear from the city, or wait for the police to arrive and explain to them about child kidnapping. The 3 men looked at each other, hearing the sirens approaching. This isn't over, Mark growled, but he grabbed the backpack with the money. Yes, it is, Isabel said with an authority impressive for a 6-year-old. Because if you show up near me or Mr. Edward again, I'm going to tell everyone about what you do. And you know, I know enough to ruin you. Mark cut the ropes, binding Isabel with a knife, clearly nervous with the sound of the approaching sirens. You're too smart for your own good. Squirt. And you're too dumb for yours, Isabel retorted, running into Edward's arms. As the 3 criminals fled through the back door, Edward hugged Isabel tightly, realizing he had been saved by her as much as she had been by him. How did you know Caroline had called the police? He asked. Isabel smiled, and for the first time Edward saw in that smile not only innocence, but also the shrewdness of a survivor. I didn't know, she admitted. But I bet they wouldn't want to find out if it was true or not. Edward laughed through his tears, marveling at the courage and intelligence of the girl in his arms. Izzy, you saved us. We saved ourselves, she corrected. That's what families do, right? They protect each other. When they left the warehouse, they found Caroline running towards them, followed by 2 police officers. She really had called for backup. She just hadn't told Isabel. Are you okay? Are you okay? She asked frantically, embracing them both. We are, Edward said, thanks to our brave girl here. But even as they gave their statements to the police, Edward knew the hardest battle was yet to come, ensuring Isabel would never again have to use her courage just to survive, but to thrive in a family that would love her unconditionally. 6 weeks had passed since that first stormy night, and Edward could barely believe the transformation his life had undergone. He stood in his mansion's garden, nervously adjusting his tie, when Isabel came running down the drive, wearing a beautiful blue dress, the same one they had bought at the mall, but which now seemed to symbolize much more than new clothes. Mr. Edward, Miss Caroline's here, she shouted, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Actually, Caroline said, appearing behind Isabel with a radiant smile. Now you can just call me Caroline, or, she hesitated, blushing slightly, Mom, if you want. Isabel stopped abruptly, her eyes wide. Really? You're going to be my real mom? If you want, Caroline said, kneeling to be at the girl's height. Edward and I talked a lot, and we decided we want to be a family, a real family. Edward watched the scene with his heart overflowing. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal paperwork, court hearings, and seemingly endless bureaucratic battles. Eleanor had finally understood that her interference had almost cost Isabel's life, and in a rare display of humility, she had offered her best lawyers to assist with the adoption process. But what if you change your mind? Isabel asked, vulnerability still evident in her voice. What if I do something wrong? Edward joined them, forming a small circle in the garden. Izzy, real families don't give up on each other. No matter what happens, we'll always be here. Always. Isabel repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. Always, Edward and Caroline confirmed in unison. Isabel was silent for a moment, processing the magnitude of that moment. Then, a smile began to form on her face. Not the polite, cautious smile she had learned to use as protection, but a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the entire garden. "So I can stop packing my bag every night?" she asked. Edward felt a pang in his heart. "You did that." "Every night," Isabel admitted. "Just in case you changed your mind, I kept everything ready to leave without being a bother." Caroline hugged Isabel tightly. "Sweetheart, you will never need to pack a bag to leave again. This is your forever home. And we are your forever family," Edward added. The moment was interrupted by a familiar voice coming from the house entrance. "Excuse me for interrupting this hallmark moment, but we have a grand opening to do." Eleanor had arrived, but she wasn't alone. Marina carried a large, colorful banner, and behind them came a small group of people, staff from the new shelter Edward had funded, some children who would be the first beneficiaries, and even some neighbors who had initially questioned Isabel's presence there, but now treated her as part of the community. "Aunt Eleanor!" Isabel shouted, running to hug the woman who, weeks earlier, had been her biggest threat. Eleanor had become one of Isabel's biggest advocates after realizing how wrong she had been. "Hello, my dear," Eleanor said, returning the hug with an affection that surprised everyone, including herself. Ready for the big day. The big day was the grand opening of Izzy's Haven, a shelter for children experiencing homelessness that Edward had established in the same neighborhood where he had first found Isabel. Caroline had left her job at the county social services to direct the project, and Isabel had insisted on actively participating, helping other children who had gone through what she had. 2 hours later, they were all gathered in front of the renovated building that would serve as the new shelter. Isabel, now officially Isabel Vance Santos, she had insisted on keeping the surname she always had and adding her adoptive parents, held a pair of scissors too large for her small hands, preparing to cut the inaugural ribbon. "Before we cut the ribbon," Edward said to the small crowd gathered, "I want to say a few words about why we are here today." He looked at Isabel, who stood between him and Caroline, radiant in her blue dress. 6 weeks ago, a very brave little girl taught me that real wealth isn't in what we possess, but in what we are willing to share. She taught me that family isn't just about blood ties, but about choosing to love and protect each other. Isabel smiled at him, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "This shelter exists because we believe every child deserves safety, love, and dignity," Edward continued. "But more than that, it exists because an extraordinary girl showed us that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages." Isabel raised the scissors, and with Edward and Caroline's help, cut the ribbon. The small crowd applauded, but Edward only had eyes for his daughter, his real daughter, finally and forever. "Mr. Edward," Isabel whispered, tugging his sleeve, "can I tell you a secret?" "Of course, Princess. That first night, when I asked to sleep in the doghouse, I wasn't just talking about the rain." "No," Isabel shook her head. "I was talking about the storm in my heart, and you didn't just give me a dry place to sleep. You gave me a home." Edward knelt and hugged Isabel, feeling that his own heart had finally found peace. "You also gave me a home, Izzy. You gave me a family." As the sun set over the garden where it all began, Edward, Caroline, and Isabel walked hand in hand back to the house, not the mansion of a lonely, single man, but the home of a family that had found each other in the storm and had chosen to stay together forever. The doghouse Isabel had asked for that first night was still there, but now it housed a small memorial garden with a plaque that read, "In memory of all children still searching for a home, and in celebration of those who have found their place in the world." Because sometimes, the most devastating storms bring the most precious gifts. And sometimes, true love begins with a simple question asked by a brave child: can I stay?